Back in the spring of 1811, during the demolition of an old tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, workers stumbled on something that would cast a long shadow over the city's past. Tucked away beneath rotting floorboards were 8 wooden boxes. Inside each one was a man's wedding ring and a small glass vial filled with what looked like medicinal powder. The rings had different names and dates engraved on them, but one thing linked them all: they once belonged to the husbands of Ruth Holloway, a woman who somehow survived 8 marriages to wealthy men over a 30-year stretch. When investigators examined the vials, what they discovered didn't just raise eyebrows, it shattered the image of the well-loved widow who had once dazzled Virginia's high society. The magistrate at the time ordered the findings to be sealed, claiming it was too sensitive and could disgrace families with deep roots in Virginia's power circles. And so, the truth was buried in historical archives for more than 200 years. But tonight, we're finally digging it up. This is the story of Ruth Holloway, one of America's most cold-blooded and methodical killers. Before we dive further into this chilling saga, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're into uncovering America's darkest secrets. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love hearing from fellow mystery lovers across the country. Now, Ruth's story doesn't begin with murder. It starts with loss. Virginia in 1780 was still reeling from the Revolutionary War. The state had been reshaped by conflict, with old loyalties broken and fortunes rising or falling overnight. Grand plantations lined the James River, their columns gleaming with the pride of a new nation. But under all that beauty, betrayal and greed simmered just below the surface. That's the world Ruth Holloway stepped into. She arrived in Richmond in the fall of 1782, a striking 8-year-old woman with auburn hair and eyes like winter fog. She said she was the widow of a Continental Army captain named Jonathan Holloway, who had died at Yorktown. Her story was simple. She had lost everything and came to Virginia for a fresh start. What made Ruth stand out wasn't just her looks, it was her mind. She spoke like someone educated in New England, read Latin, and knew an awful lot about herbs and medicine. At a time when doctors were few and disease was everywhere, her skills quickly made her a valuable asset to Richmond's upper class. She even carried a leather-bound journal full of old remedies, passed down, she claimed, through generations of her family. The elite welcomed her with open arms. The war had left a shortage of eligible women, and Ruth had everything society craved: grace, conversation, and the ability to cure everything from consumption to melancholy. She soon set up a small but respectable home on Clay Street and began treating the city's wealthiest families. But while Richmond looked pristine on the outside, darker forces were at play. The war hadn't just made heroes, it had created opportunists. Behind closed doors, people whispered about men who had traded sides for profit convoys that were mysteriously ambushed, and secret networks that may have worked with the British. These traitors hadn't vanished after the war. They flourished, their reward being land wealth and power carved out of the ashes of loyalist estates. And it was into this world of secret scandal and shifting allegiances that Ruth Holloway began her rise. A rise that would leave 8 men dead and a trail of unanswered questions buried beneath Richmond's genteel surface. In a time when fortunes were rising on the ruins of war and betrayal, Ruth Holloway began weaving herself into the lives of Virginia's most powerful men. Somehow she always seemed to catch the eye of the elite tobacco tycoons, land speculators, shipping barons, even men in politics. One by one, they fell for her charm, married her with lavish ceremony, and each met an untimely end. To most of society, their deaths seemed like sad coincidences. But among the enslaved workers in those grand homes, a different story was being whispered. They spoke quietly of strange illnesses that began soon after marriage: sharp stomach pains, sudden weakness, then death. But in a world where their voices held no legal weight, their warnings were dismissed as nothing more than superstition. The first husband to die was Colonel Edmund Fairfax. It was August of 1783, just 6 months after marrying Ruth. Fairfax was a robust man, 45 years old, with no history of illness. Yet on the morning of August 15th, he was found dead in his study by his house servant, Jupiter. Though Jupiter's account never reached White Ears, what he saw that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. He'd been awakened around midnight by strange sounds from the colonel's study. Not the usual rustle of paper or clink of brandy, but something softer, more unsettling. A low moan. The scrape of a chair. Curious Jupiter crept to the window and peered inside. He saw the colonel hunched over his desk, clutching his stomach in pain. Beside him stood Ruth, calm and collected, holding a steaming cup of what looked like tea. "Drink this, my dear Edmund Jupiter," heard her say, her voice low and soothing. "It will ease the pain. I prepared it with special care." The colonel lifted his head with effort, his face pale and slick with sweat. "The pain. It's getting worse. Maybe we should send for Dr. Harrison." Ruth laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Nonsense, darling. Dr. Harrison is miles away, and this remedy has worked for generations in my family. Trust me." Her tone was sweet, but something in it made Jupiter uneasy, an edge, a firmness that didn't allow for questions. Fairfax drank. Within minutes, his moans turned to gasps. His body convulsed. Then he collapsed, scattering papers across the floor. Ruth stood there perfectly still. Only after several long moments did she begin to move calmly, rinsing the cup in a basin of water she had prepared ahead of time. Only then did she begin to scream. When Dr. Hugh Harrison arrived at dawn, he found Ruth clinging to her husband's body, weeping uncontrollably. She told him Edmund had been ill for days, likely due to stress from business and a sensitive stomach. The doctor's examination found nothing suspicious. No signs of injury. Just symptoms that matched a common enough diagnosis in Virginia's climate, gastric fever, from spoiled food or tainted water. He listed it as the official cause of death and offered his sympathy to the grieving widow. What Dr. Harrison didn't know, and what Ruth had counted on, was that her remedies were never about healing. Before coming to Richmond, Ruth had spent time in Philadelphia, where she had grown close to a disgraced doctor named Marcus Wainwright. Expelled for dangerous experimentation, Wainwright had quietly studied how native plants could mimic fatal illnesses without leaving a trace. His research had never been published, but Ruth had memorized it and improved on it. She discovered that mixing certain alkaloids with everyday herbs created potions that in small doses soothed pain, but in larger amounts killed slowly and quietly. Her leather journal didn't hold family cures. It was a recipe book for murder. Colonel Fairfax's funeral drew the highest ranks of Richmond society. Ruth played her part flawlessly. She fainted at the graveside, had to be carried away, and received endless sympathy from people who never guessed they were shaking hands with a killer. Colonel Fairfax's will, signed not long after his wedding, left Ruth with a generous inheritance, his home on Clay Street, a hefty sum in gold, and acres of valuable land. But whatever grief she displayed at his funeral didn't last long. Just 3 months later, Richmond's social circles began buzzing when Ruth was seen in the company of Captain William Randolph, a wealthy shipping magnate who had made his fortune supplying the Continental Army during the war. Some whispered that she had moved on too quickly, but any criticism was quickly silenced. After all, people said a woman alone needed protection, and Randolph was a man of means and honor. What no one realized was that Ruth hadn't fallen for him by chance. None of her marriages were random. Every man she charmed shared one thing in common. They had all belonged to a secret group that had passed intelligence to the British during the Revolution. Colonel Fairfax had been that group's treasurer, the man in charge of distributing British gold to American traders. Ruth's arrival in Richmond and her relationships with these powerful men weren't strokes of fate. They were the first calculated steps in a quiet, methodical vendetta, one that would end with 8 graves. Ruth married Randolph in January 1784. By that fall, he was dead. His passing followed the same chilling pattern as Fairfax's. Though known for his strength and ability to survive brutal sea storms, the captain fell ill and died within 3 days, his body racked with pain and weakness. Dr. Harrison, once again summoned too late to help, called it bilious fever, a common enough diagnosis. But while Jupiter had since been sold to another household, Richmond's enslaved community kept its own channels of communication alive. Word spread fast. Another husband dead. Another stomach illness. Another suspicious cup of tea. This time it was old Caesar, a servant in the Randolph household, who noticed the same strange details Jupiter had described. Ruth tending to her husband alone. Her calmness in the face of his suffering. Her refusal to allow another doctor near. But Caesar discovered something far more dangerous. While cleaning the study after the captain's death, Caesar spotted a loose board in the wall. Behind it was a tiny vial filled with a fine white powder that gave off a bitter almond smell. When he ran into Jupiter at the Richmond market and showed him the find, Jupiter's face turned to stone. "Same thing I saw back at the Fairfax house," he whispered, glancing around. "Found one in the kitchen after the colonel died. Showed it to the cook, and she told me to throw it in the river and never speak of it again." From that moment, the enslaved workers began tracking Ruth more closely. They passed notes and stories between households, building their own silent record. Ruth always made the medicine herself. She kept her tools and ingredients locked in a chest no one was allowed to open, and she had an uncanny knowledge of wild plants. They watched her take long, solitary walks into the woods outside Richmond, returning with baskets full of herbs she refused to let anyone else touch. But while their suspicions grew, so did Ruth's status. Captain Randolph had left her even wealthier than Fairfax, and once again, she played the grieving widow to perfection. Society saw her as a tragic figure, twice widowed, unlucky in love, but full of grace and dignity. Far from being shunned, she was embraced more tightly than ever. The grand families of Virginia fought to include her in their events, viewing her as a woman worthy of sympathy and admiration. What they didn't realize was that the woman they welcomed into their drawing rooms was quietly stalking her next prey. Ruth's third husband was Judge Thomas Henley, a respected figure in Virginia politics and a key architect of the state's new legal system. Their romance was brief but intense, with the widowed judge claiming Ruth had rekindled his belief in love. They married in June of 1785 in a ceremony that became one of the biggest social events of the year. But Henley would last just 7 months. His death in January 1786 stunned the city, not just because of who he was, but because of how it happened, right in the middle of a dinner party at their home, surrounded by a dozen of Richmond's most prominent citizens. Henley had spent the evening in perfect health and high spirits, entertaining guests with stories of constitutional debates and bold visions for Virginia's future. But after dessert, Ruth offered him a special tonic, something she said her mother used to make for her father to help digestion. Minutes later, the judge clutched his stomach in visible pain, his face paling as his strength faded in front of stunned onlookers. It was the third time Dr. Harrison had been summoned to tend to one of Ruth's dying husbands, and by now, he had quiet suspicions. Still, suspicion wasn't proof, and Ruth's actions were always above reproach. She hadn't been alone with her husband. The symptoms fit a dozen common ailments. And with her wealth, social status, and pristine reputation, accusing her of murder would require evidence no one had. But the pattern continued. Ruth moved through her marriages like clockwork, each death more precise than the last. Her fourth husband, plantation owner George Carrington, died in 1787 of what was called acute dyspepsia. The fifth merchant, Samuel Bradford, fell to nervous fever in 1788. The sixth banker, Edward Custis, died in 1789 of what Dr. Harrison described as gastric apoplexy. Each man left her wealthier. Each funeral was marked by Ruth's dramatic mourning, and each new union stirred more whispered doubts. By the time Custis died, even the most skeptical observers began noticing that something didn't add up. Then, in late 1789, a familiar face returned to the picture. Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the disgraced physician Ruth had once known in Philadelphia, quietly arrived in Richmond, claiming to seek a fresh start. He rented a small house on the edge of town, kept to himself, and saw very few patients. But Caesar, now working for a family near Wainwright's home, noticed something strange. Ruth visited him regularly, always at dusk, always leaving under the cover of night. These weren't social calls. They were business meetings. Wainwright had pieced together Ruth's secret. Through his own network, he discovered her identity and realized just how much money she had accumulated. But he didn't come to expose her. He came to cash in. He offered Ruth a deal: he would keep supplying her with new and more effective poisons, and in return he would receive a share of each inheritance. But Wainwright made a fatal mistake. He believed Ruth's motives were rooted in greed. He thought he could push for more bigger cuts, bigger plans, even expansion to other cities. What he didn't understand was that Ruth wasn't doing this for money. Her killings were a mission, a cold, calculated form of justice. She didn't tolerate disloyalty. She didn't compromise. And she certainly didn't share. The series of mysterious deaths that had started with Colonel Fairfax were leading to something bigger, a reckoning that would shake Virginia's ruling class. Ruth had nearly finished her list. Every man she married had been part of the secret network that betrayed her first husband during the war. Only two remained. The first was Dr. Harrison himself, the man who had served as the group's link to the medical community. The second was the most powerful target of all, Governor Edmund Randolph, the man who had orchestrated the entire betrayal from his seat in the colonial government. By the fall of 1790, Ruth Holloway's careful campaign of vengeance was nearing its end. But that autumn brought a complication. She hadn't planned for a complication that threatened to unravel everything. His name was Captain Jonathan Hale, a former Continental Army intelligence officer who had spent years tracking down traitors from the Revolutionary War. Officially, he was in Richmond to mediate land disputes tied to confiscated Loyalist properties. Unofficially, he was hunting the remnants of a secret network that had supplied British forces with American intelligence. And as his investigation deepened, he noticed a disturbing pattern. Several suspected members of that network had died under odd circumstances, often shortly after marrying the same woman. What made Hale a real threat was his training. He had been taught to detect patterns, spot inconsistencies, and follow trails that others missed. Unlike Richmond's social elite, who still viewed Ruth as an unlucky widow touched by tragedy, Hale began to see something far more calculated. And the break he needed came from a surprising source. Over dinner one evening with Dr. Harrison, the captain casually brought up the spate of high-profile deaths that had plagued Richmond society in recent years. Harrison, still haunted by his involvement and increasingly unsettled, confessed his own doubts. "It's the strangest thing," he said, swirling his glass. "Ruth Holloway has the worst luck I've ever seen. But she's also one of the most attentive wives I've known. She's well read in medicine, always at her husband's side, always the first to suggest treatments. If I didn't know better, I'd say she was trying to save them. He stopped short, catching himself. Hale leaned in. Trying to save them, rather than what Dr. Harrison hesitated. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "It's just that in 3 decades of practice, I've never seen so many men die the same way in one household. It's not natural." That night, Hale began digging into Ruth's past. What he found chilled him. There was no record of a Captain Jonathan Holloway in any Continental Army registry. No mention of him at Yorktown or on any casualty list. The woman calling herself Ruth Holloway had entered Richmond with a completely fabricated identity. Her true name, her background, everything was a lie. And yet, she had managed to charm, marry, and bury 6 of Virginia's most powerful men without drawing a single formal accusation. While Hale followed her trail, Ruth had already moved on to her 7th target. His name was Alexander Fitzhugh, a shipping magnate with ties to every major port from Norfolk to Charleston. On the surface, he was a respected businessman. But during the war, he had used his position supplying the Continental Army to gather intelligence. Intelligence he funneled to the British in exchange for gold. Dozens of American supply lines had been compromised because of his betrayal, costing hundreds of lives. To Ruth, Fitzhugh's guilt was personal. His name had been at the top of her husband's old journal, circled in red. And now, after years of quiet planning, she was within reach. As always, she approached him as the grieving widow, soft-spoken, elegant, and in need of a protector. She slowly revealed her business sense, her knowledge of finance, her ability to read ledgers and understand trade routes. Fitzhugh, flattered and intrigued, saw in Ruth not just a wife, but a partner. He had no idea he was falling into the same trap as the 6 before him. But this time, Ruth wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Captain Hale was watching. Alexander Fitzhugh, a widower himself, was quickly drawn to Ruth's disarming mix of vulnerability and intelligence. Within 3 months, he proposed. But this time, Ruth's path to the altar wasn't as smooth. Captain Jonathan Hale had quietly begun sounding the alarm. He confided his suspicions to a few trusted members of Richmond's elite, and whispers began to circulate. The mysterious widow, who always seemed to survive her husband's wealthier each time, was no longer above suspicion. When Fitzhugh publicly announced his engagement, not everyone celebrated. At a private meeting at the Richmond Club, tobacco magnate Robert Carter pulled him aside. "Alexander, surely you've noticed the pattern," he warned. 7 husbands, 7 unexplained deaths. Even if you believe it's all tragic coincidence, don't you think it deserves a closer look? Fitzhugh's response showed just how deeply Ruth had worked her influence. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern," he said calmly. "But let's be honest. You're talking about rumors and speculation. This woman has been examined by doctors, cleared by magistrates. Are we really going to condemn her because misfortune keeps finding her doorstep?" What he didn't know was that Ruth had already begun studying him in return. Thanks to files stolen from Dr. Marcus Wainwright, she had uncovered damning details about Fitzhugh's wartime activities, specifically his role in leaking American supply routes to British forces, a betrayal that cost hundreds of lives. Wainwright, still hoping to blackmail Ruth into sharing more of her inheritance, had been conducting his own investigation into the men she had targeted. His findings exposed a chilling truth. Every one of her husbands had been part of a secret group called the Covenant of Prosperity, a wartime intelligence ring that sold out the revolution in exchange for British gold and promises of post-war privilege. When Ruth learned that Wainwright knew about the Covenant and about her, she decided he had become too dangerous to keep alive. On a bitter February night in 1791, the disgraced doctor was found dead in his study, slumped over his notes beside a shattered glass vial. The official ruling was suicide, a tragic end for a man tormented by his own toxic experiments. Ruth attended the funeral dressed in black and weeping. But inside she felt relief. The only person who could trace her poisons back to their source was gone. With Wainwright out of the picture, she was free to finish what she had started. On March 15, 1791, Alexander Fitzhugh and Ruth Holloway were married in a ceremony far more subdued than her previous weddings. The guest list was smaller. The smiles were tighter. And among the attendees was Captain Hale watching from a distance. He studied her closely throughout the day, noting her perfect posture, her polite laughter, her serene expression. If she was a murderer, she was one of the finest actresses he had ever seen. 4 months later, Fitzhugh was dead. The illness began just like the others, stomach pain, fatigue, then rapid decline. He died on July 20th, 1791. This time Dr. Harrison conducted his most thorough examination, yet driven by the uneasy knowledge that he might be the only one who understood what was really happening. He found no legal proof of poisoning, no trace of exotic substances. But in his heart, he knew. This was no fever. This was murder. At the funeral, Ruth gave the performance of her life. She fainted at the graveside, cried inconsolably, and secluded herself in her Clay Street home for weeks. But those closest to her began to notice subtle changes. She walked with more confidence. Her voice carried more weight in conversation. The softness that had once cloaked her actions was beginning to slip. Ruth Holloway no longer needed to play the role of helpless widow. She had become something far more dangerous. With Alexander Fitzhugh gone, she had completed nearly all of her mission. 7 of the 8 men who had betrayed her first husband were dead. All that remained was one final name, the man who had been there from the beginning. The one who had watched every death, signed every certificate, and now stood in her way. Dr. Harrison. By the autumn of 1791, Ruth Holloway believed she was untouchable. 7 names on her list had been crossed off. Only one remained. But what she didn't know was that Captain Jonathan Hale had uncovered the truth she'd worked so hard to bury. In the confiscated files of a captured British intelligence officer, Hale found references to a mysterious American informant known only as the Widow, a woman whose husband had been executed by Patriot forces and who had vowed revenge on those responsible. The description was vague, but something about it felt familiar. Cross-referencing those documents with military records, Hale made a discovery that shook him to the core. Captain Jonathan Holloway had been real, but he hadn't died at Yorktown, as Ruth claimed. He had been a British agent, a deep-cover spy embedded within the Continental Army. Captured in 1779, he was executed by the Americans after being betrayed by members of his own spy ring. That same network, now known as the Covenant of Prosperity, had turned on him to save themselves and gain favor with the rising American leadership. Ruth wasn't seeking justice on behalf of a fallen patriot. She was avenging a loyalist spy. Her campaign of vengeance wasn't rooted in grief, it was treason. And suddenly, every man she had eliminated took on a different meaning. She wasn't punishing traitors to the revolution. She was erasing those who had turned on the British. Hale's discovery came at a dangerous time. Ruth had already set her sights on her final target. And it wasn't Dr. Harrison, as he had assumed. It was Governor Edmund Randolph, the most powerful man in Virginia and the secret leader of the very organization that had betrayed her husband. For months, Ruth had slowly worked her way into Randolph's social orbit. She appeared at the right gatherings. She charmed his allies. She impressed him with her intelligence and political insight. Unlike her earlier victims, Randolph was already married, but his wife had long been ill-confined to bed and absent from public life. Ruth didn't approach him as a fragile widow in need of protection. she came as an equal. A woman of independent means, political savvy, and connections. A potential ally. What made this final courtship so perilous was that Randolph was no fool. He had navigated the treacherous waters of revolutionary politics, helped draft the U.S. Constitution, and built a power base that extended beyond Virginia's borders. If anyone could expose Ruth, it was him. But Ruth had an advantage. She had already read him. She knew he wasn't loyal to a cause, only to power. During the war, Randolph had supported the British, not out of ideology, but calculation. And when the tide turned, he betrayed his British contacts to secure his future in the new American Republic. Ruth knew this. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. In the spring of 1792, Randolph's wife died of consumption. Ruth attended the funeral with all the expected grace, then quietly stepped back from society, giving the appearance of respectful mourning. Behind the scenes, her plan was nearing its end. Around this time, Captain Hale made one final attempt to intervene. He secured a private audience with the governor and laid out everything: Ruth's false identity, the suspicious deaths, the evidence of her connection to each of the Covenant's members. But Randolph's reaction was not what Hale expected. Instead of outrage or alarm, the governor seemed intrigued. "You misunderstand her," Captain Randolph said, after hearing the full account. "If what you say is true, then she has performed a service that no one else dared attempt. These men were traitors to their country. And if she removed them efficiently, discreetly, without scandal, perhaps she deserves praise, not suspicion." Hale left that meeting deeply unsettled. He had warned the highest authority in the state, only to find that the governor wasn't just ignoring the threat, he was considering an alliance. With Ruth's skill and Randolph's power, they could eliminate anyone they deemed inconvenient, using the full weight of government to hide their crimes. But what Hale didn't know was that Randolph had already conducted his own investigation into Ruth. He knew exactly who she was. He knew about her husband, and he knew he was her final target. But instead of running, Randolph made a bold decision. He would confront her, not to stop her, but to recruit her. He saw her not as a killer, but as a weapon. The confrontation came during a private dinner at the governor's mansion in June 1792. Ruth had accepted the invitation, believing it to be another step in their deepening relationship. But after the meal, Randolph led her to his private study. There, behind closed doors, he looked her in the eye with the calm authority of a man who had played both sides before. "Mrs. Holloway," he said evenly. "Or should I say, Mrs. Jonathan Holloway, widow of the British agent executed in 1779. I think it's time we dispensed with pretenses and spoke honestly about your situation." Governor Randolph said, his voice calm but cold. Ruth's reaction was quick but composed. Her fingers brushed the edge of her reticule where a familiar glass vial rested. But she froze when she saw the governor watching her, not with fear but with a faint smirk of amusement. He already knew. "I see we understand each other," he continued. "Good. That will make our negotiation much simpler. You see, Mrs. Holloway, I know everything. I know about your long campaign of revenge. I know you've eliminated 7 members of the Covenant of Prosperity. And I know you believe I'm the final name on your list." Ruth's gray eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since his reveal, she spoke. "And you're not afraid, Governor. You betrayed my husband to save your own skin. You've stood by while I removed your co-conspirators one by one. What makes you think I won't complete my work tonight?" Randolph's smile widened sharp and cold. "Because you need me alive more than you need me dead," he said. "You see, my dear, there weren't 8 members of the Covenant. There were 9. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. For over a decade, she believed her mission was nearly complete, that one final act of vengeance would close the book. Now everything shifted. "Who?" she asked barely above a whisper. "Captain Jonathan Hale," Randolph replied. "The very man who's been investigating you. He was the Covenant's intelligence analyst. He's the one who identified your husband as a liability. He's the one who recommended his execution." The air in the study thickened with silence. Just when we thought we'd uncovered every dark secret in Richmond, the horror deepens. If this story's giving you chills, hit that like button. Share it with a friend who loves true crime and historical mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss the deadly end to this saga. The game between Ruth Holloway and Governor Randolph had just entered its final, most dangerous phase, with Captain Hale as the unsuspecting prize in a deadly contest between two of the most ruthless minds in American history. Randolph believed this revelation would bring Ruth to heel, that she would abandon her quest and join him. He was wrong. "You propose an alliance, Governor," Ruth said steadily. "But what assurance do I have that you won't betray me, just as you betrayed my husband, the British, and your fellow conspirators?" Randolph leaned back, studying her with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived revolutions by trusting no one. "Because we hold each other's secrets. You know my wartime sins. I know your trail of blood. We are bound by mutual destruction. Neither of us can expose the other without risking everything." But Ruth had already made her choice. This conversation wasn't negotiation. It was confirmation. She now knew the identity of her final target, and she knew Randolph couldn't be trusted. There would be no alliance. What followed was a slow-burning game of deception that played out over the summer of 1792. Ruth pretended to accept Randolph's offer. Behind the scenes, she prepared to eliminate them both. Randolph, for his part, believed he had secured the services of a lethal asset until she became inconvenient. And Captain Hale, he remained in the dark. He continued gathering evidence against Ruth, believing he was closing in, unaware that both Ruth and Randolph were watching his every move. The climax came on August 15th, 1792, exactly 9 years to the day after Colonel Fairfax's death. Ruth invited both men to a private dinner at her Clay Street mansion. The invitation was presented as a business proposition, an opportunity for mutual benefit. Both men accepted, each thinking they held the advantage. The dinner began with polite conversation, fine wine, and the flicker of candlelight. Ruth played the perfect hostess. Randolph and Hale matched each other in quiet suspicion and veiled politeness. But beneath the surface, the tension was razor sharp. Each person at the table knew more than they let on. Each was waiting for the moment to strike. Ruth had spent weeks preparing this night. Her poisons had grown more refined with each kill. For Randolph, she had prepared a slow-acting mixture of foxglove and hemlock, formulated to simulate a sudden heart attack. It was hidden in a rare French brandy, a vintage she presented as a gesture of trust. For Hale, she used a more devious approach, a contact poison carefully applied to the rim of his wine glass. It would absorb through his skin, mimic the symptoms of apoplexy, and kill him hours after he left far from her home. But Ruth had overlooked one detail. Governor Randolph had come prepared. His informants had warned him. Servants had reported the herbs, the strange purchases, the midnight walks to abandoned kitchens where she prepared her compounds. Worst of all, someone had found her journal, the one with meticulous notes on every murder she had committed. Randolph knew exactly what she was planning. As the three sat down to dinner, Ruth sensed the subtle shift in the air. Governor Randolph was relaxed, too. Relaxed, wearing the smug confidence of a man who thought he'd won. Captain Hale, by contrast, looked tense, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Ruth read the room as a sign that her deception was working. Randolph believed she was under his control. Hale knew something was wrong, but not how wrong. The conversation began with polite civility, but beneath the surface every word carried weight. Ruth steered the discussion toward philosophy, her preferred camouflage for deadly intent. "I've always believed," she said smoothly, serving the main course with care, "that betrayal demands consequence. no matter how much time has passed. Randolph nodded with a smile. Justice delayed is not justice denied. In fact, delay often makes the reckoning far more complete. Captain Hale, growing uneasy, tried to shift the tone. Surely we can agree that revenge, however justified it may seem, is ultimately destructive. The purpose of law is to stop individuals from taking justice into their own hands. Ruth's smile didn't reach her eyes. But what if the law itself is in the hands of those who deserve punishment? What if justice has been bought and buried by the guilty? And in that moment, Hale understood. This was no hypothetical debate. Ruth wasn't talking about ideas, she was talking about him. About Randolph. About what she intended to do. His hand drifted toward his coat where his pistol rested. But Randolph caught his movement with a sharp glance, a silent warning not to escalate. "Gentlemen," Ruth said as she rose graceful and calm, "let's move to the library for brandy and for honesty. I have something special to share." They followed. Each step down the hall tightened the suspense. They weren't just moving into another room. They were walking into the final act of a deadly play, 13 years in the making. The library was perfectly staged. Heavy curtains muffled sound from the street. The servants had been dismissed for the night. No one would witness what came next. Ruth had planned everything, the poisons, the cleanup, the story she'd tell when it was over. She positioned herself between the men and the door. Randolph noticed, so did Hale. But both believed they could still control the outcome. Ruth moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses from an elegant decanter. Her voice was as smooth as the liquor. "You both think you figured me out," she said. "Governor Randolph, you believe you've turned me into your assassin. Captain Hale, you believe you've built a case strong enough to end me. You're both right. And you're both wrong. Because neither of you will leave this room alive." She turned, holding out the glasses. "Governor Randolph, you die because you orchestrated the betrayal that murdered my husband. Captain Hale, you die because you identified him as a threat. You were the one who gave the order." Randolph's mask finally slipped. His voice rose tight with panic. "You underestimate the consequences of killing a sitting governor. My death will not go unnoticed." Ruth laughed, genuine and cold. "Governor, I've killed 8 powerful men and walked away untouched. I've built a fortune, a reputation, and a legend of sorrow. What makes you think killing you and Captain Hale will be any more difficult?" Hale, his training kicking, enacted. He lunged toward Ruth, hoping to disarm her before she could make a move. But Ruth had planned for this moment. With swift precision, she threw the contents of 1 glass into his face. It wasn't poison. It was something worse, a searing botanical irritant made from native Virginia plants designed to cause immediate blindness and agony. Hale reeled back, screaming, clawing at his burning eyes. In one smooth motion, Ruth reached beneath her shawl and drew a pistol, small, elegant, and stolen from a past victim. Before she could aim, Randolph lunged at her, hoping to knock her off balance. But he had underestimated her, physically, strategically, fatally. Ruth turned as Governor Randolph lunged, her movements smooth and calculated. With quiet precision, she brought the pistol up and aimed it at his chest. "I don't think so, Governor," she said calmly. "After 13 years of planning, I'm not about to let either of you spoil my moment of justice." What followed wasn't chaos. It was a confrontation choreographed down to the smallest detail. Ruth Holloway was no longer the grieving widow. She was no longer merely a poisoner. She was a tactician, a predator who had learned the shape of men's egos and the cracks in their armor. She had spent over a decade studying human behavior and exploiting it without mercy. "You want the truth about your precious covenant of prosperity?" she asked, keeping the pistol steady on Randolph and glancing toward Captain Hale, who was slowly regaining his vision. "It was never about patriotism. You weren't fighting spies. You were selling information to whoever paid best. You changed sides as easily as changing coats. She stepped closer, her voice low and deadly. My husband wasn't executed because he was a threat to American freedom. He was killed because he uncovered your corruption and tried to blackmail you. And you couldn't risk either side finding out. So you handed him to the Patriots as a gift. Let them do your dirty work. Randolph's face went pale. That's impossible, he muttered. Those records, everything was destroyed. Ruth gave a cold smile. You assumed love made me weak. But love is what made me relentless. While you were counting votes and selling secrets, I was collecting evidence. 13 years, every document, every name, every lie. And then she revealed the full scope of what she had discovered. The Covenant hadn't just leaked information during the war. They had stolen supplies from the Continental Army, sold out their own men, and used the chaos to kill off rivals, positioning themselves to profit no matter who won. They weren't patriots. They were parasites. My husband found out in 1779, Ruth said. But instead of reporting you, he made a mistake. He threatened you. And you let him die, just as you let all the others who stood in your way. Captain Hale, finally seeing clearly, stared at her in disbelief. You're not just avenging a spy, he said, almost whispering. You're punishing the rot that killed him. Ruth nodded. Jonathan was a British agent, yes. But he was also my husband. The father of the child I lost when I ran for my life. And the only person who ever truly believed in me. Your conspiracy didn't just take his life. It destroyed mine. You turned me into this. And in that moment, it was clear. Ruth Holloway hadn't just killed her enemies. She had outplayed them. One by one, she had brought down a secret empire built on betrayal. Randolph, desperate now, tried a final gambit. Spare me, he said. And I'll give you something better than revenge. Power. With your skill and my connections, we could run this country. We could shape history together. But Ruth shook her head. You still don't understand. This was never about power or wealth. This was about love. Love for a man you murdered. Love for a life you shattered. And love demands justice, real justice, the kind your laws were never meant to deliver. She paused, her eyes cold and unflinching. You want to shape history, you already have. And now it's time for the final chapter. What followed unfolded with the precision of a perfectly executed plan. Ruth had orchestrated every detail, not just to kill, but to control the story that would be told after she was gone. The next morning, servants found the bodies in the library. Governor Randolph was slumped in an armchair, a bullet wound in his chest. Captain Hale lay nearby, his face disfigured by chemical burns, a shattered crystal decanter beside his head. A pistol, his own, rested loosely in his hand. To the outside world, it looked like a final confrontation between two powerful men. A secret disagreement that had spiraled into deadly violence. A tragic but tidy ending. No one suspected the grieving widow. And by the time the news spread, Ruth Holloway was gone. Final lines for voiceover or closing narration. Ruth Holloway vanished from Virginia society that summer. Some believe she fled to Europe under a new name. Others think she died quietly in a small town, her mission complete. Her crimes were never proven. Her name was never charged. But for those who knew the truth, she wasn't a widow, a victim, or a villain. She was vengeance wrapped in silk and shadow. And she rewrote justice on her own terms. The room told a violent story. Chairs were overturned, bookshelves upended, papers scattered across the floor like debris from a storm. It was the chaos of desperation, rage, and death. But what shocked the arriving servants most was what they found in the small storage closet off the library. A woman bound and gagged, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. It was Ruth Holloway. When they untied her, she collapsed in their arms, incoherent, dazed, visibly shaken. She couldn't speak for several minutes. When Dr. Harrison arrived shortly after and examined both the scene and Ruth herself, her account of the night's events was delivered in a voice that trembled with pain. According to Ruth, Captain Hale had come to the dinner agitated and obsessed. He accused Governor Randolph of treason, demanded that Ruth testify against him, and brandished documents he claimed were proof of the governor's wartime corruption. Randolph tried to de-escalate, she said, but tempers flared. The men began shouting, then struggling. Captain Hale drew his pistol, she sobbed. The governor tried to take it from him, and the gun went off. Then glass shattered. Someone shoved me into the closet. I heard them fighting. Then, silence. Dr. Harrison's examination confirmed many parts of the story. The physical evidence, the bruises on Ruth's wrists and ankles, the rope burns, the broken decanter, the scattered documents all supported a violent confrontation between the two men. Ruth's injuries seemed real, her grief convincing. Her reputation as a dignified widow only reinforced the notion that she had simply been caught in a deadly feud between men. With both Randolph and Hale dead, and no witnesses to contradict her, the investigation barely scratched the surface. The charred remains of Hale's supposed documents were recovered from the fireplace, their contents lost forever. The official conclusion was simple: a tragic dispute between two powerful men over old wartime secrets, with Ruth Holloway as an unfortunate bystander. But the truth was far more calculated. Ruth had orchestrated every detail of that evening. The documents Hale had supposedly brought were forged meticulously prepared over months. The irritant that blinded him had been developed specifically to simulate a chaotic struggle. Even her own injuries were self-inflicted, inflicted using methods she had mastered over years of study, painful enough to be convincing, harmless enough to leave no permanent damage. The deaths of Governor Randolph and Captain Hale marked the end of her long, deliberate revenge against the covenant of prosperity. But they did not mark the end of Ruth Holloway's story. With all 9 men eliminated, Ruth had not only fulfilled her promise to her husband, she had amassed immense wealth and influence. In the months that followed, she withdrew from public life, citing grief and fragile health. She sold the Clay Street mansion and moved to a quieter estate on the outskirts of Richmond, where she lived in tasteful seclusion with only a few trusted servants. But Ruth had not retired from power, only from visibility. Over the next decades, she became a silent force in Virginia politics. From behind the scenes, she shaped elections, destroyed reputations, and manipulated alliances. Her influence was subtle, often invisible, but always effective. She never remarried, claiming no man could replace what she had lost. But her correspondence stretched far beyond Richmond, reaching judges, governors, and industrialists across the eastern seaboard. When Ruth Holloway died in 1834 at the age of 80, Virginia mourned the passing of a brilliant, sorrowful, and enigmatic woman. But the true reckoning came only afterward. Among her private papers, investigators discovered something extraordinary. Not only detailed records of her 9 murders, but dozens of other schemes, manipulations, and engineered downfalls. She had blackmailed corrupt officials, bankrupted dishonest businessmen, and socially annihilated anyone who posed a threat to her carefully curated world. Most chilling of all was a journal written in a complex cipher that took months to crack. Inside was the unfiltered mind of Ruth Holloway. In page after page, she revealed that her vengeance against the covenant of prosperity had only been the beginning. In her words, she had become an agent of necessary justice, removing those who, in her view, corrupted society, destroyed lives, and escaped the consequences of their actions. Over time, she refined her methods to perfection. Her later killings left no trace, no suspicion. Some were declared natural deaths, others tragic accidents. But they were all, in her eyes, deserved. The Ruth who had arrived in Richmond in 1782, grieving, frightened, and alone, was gone. What remained was something the nation had never seen before. A woman who had turned grief into vengeance, vengeance into power, and power into legacy. Ruth Holloway did not fade into history. She bent it. Closing narration. She was not a symbol of sorrow. She was a master of silence. Not a victim of the past, but its reckoning. In a country born from revolution, Ruth Holloway became a revolution of her own. Justice in her hands was never blind, it was patient, and it always found its target.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.